So hello everyone, my name is बुरहानुद्दीन रशीद. यहाँ पे कितने लोग मोबाइल डेवलपमेंट करते हैं और कितने लोग फ्लटर में हैं? ठीक है. और मतलब कंपनी के लिए एप्लीकेशंस बनाते हैं, उसमें कितने लोग हैं? एक ही. ठीक है, ठीक है, ठीक है. So today I'm going to talk about a feature called macros, a game-changing feature for Flutter. So people who have used Flutter might be helpful for them, but if you are not using Flutter, then also it's a good thing to know, good knowledge for other features building in the another languages. So anyway, you will learn something new. I hope you learn something new from here. So yeah, let's get started. So I think ये फेब में इंडियन कम्युनिटी समिट हुआ था. आई डोंट नो विच प्लेस इज दिस इन उदयपुर. को बता सकता है क्या ये कौन सी जगह है? हाँ, कौन सी है? हाँ ठीक है, तो वो वही का ही है. सो मुझे पता नहीं था इसलिए मैंने फ़ोटो डाल दिया यहाँ पे. ठीक है. सो या about me, I usually write blogs on burhanrashid50.com, Flutter related content, widgettricks.substack.com है, and then also I run live classes, effectivefluttertip.com. So this is about me. So yeah, we'll talk about macros, and before we talk about macros, I just wanted to give a brief overview on what's new in Flutter. So in Google I/O, Flutter releases a version 3.22, which was the latest version at that time. Currently there are new version as well. So I'll just give a quick update on what's new was there in that update. There is a WebAssembly support for Flutter. Anybody knows about WebAssembly? Anybody have built web applications? Yeah, so there is a target which is way more faster to run your application, which is basically called WebAssembly. Now Flutter Web supports that. And then there is a Impeller update. It's just a basic rendering engine update. Nothing you have to worry about, but it's just an update there. Then there is a flavor conditioning, asset bundling. So what will happen earlier कि हर एक flavor के लिए you have to bundle all the images. So अलग अलग flavor की जब आप apps बनाते हो, so सारे images आपको एक साथ bundle करने पड़ते हैं, जिसकी वजह से आपकी APK की size बढ़ जाती है. Now with this you can define a condition कि आपको कौन कौन सी images रखनी है and कौन कौन सी नहीं रखनी, so that it will reduce your APK size. And then there is a tool to validate deep link, predictive back gesture. So Android and then Android के new version में there are different kind of gesture which now supported in Flutter as well. There is an enforced version requirement and KitKat version जो था पहले उसका support end कर दिया है. So now it's a start from Lollipop. So whatever app you build from Flutter, it will support from Lollipop. And then there is a dev tool extension improvement, and then there is a macros in Dart, which I am going to talk about today. So macros in Dart, those who are developing Flutter and knows Dart, have you heard about macros? If anyone have, can raise your hand. Who has heard about macros? No? Nobody? Okay. So macros is nothing but a Dart. Macro is a user-defined piece of code that makes in order to code as a parameter and operate on a real time to create modifier and add declaration. किस को समझ में आया? Anybody? Okay. So basically this means is a code which write codes. ठीक है, एक code आप लिखते हो that can write a different code, right? So this is what a macros does. And it's a Dart language feature and not a Flutter framework feature as such. So ये language का part है, framework का part नहीं है. And it's experimental. So अभी इसको use करके production पे app deploy मत करना, क्योंकि ये experimental है. तो production पे जाके कुछ हुआ फिर blame मत करना कि अरे यार ये तो code फट गया है. ठीक है. So it's an experimental. So be very very careful with this. Okay. और also there is a history. This is not something new feature come out of the blue. बहुत सारे लैंग्वेज ने ऑलरेडी इनोवेट कर चुके हैं. इट्स जस्ट दैट कि बहुत से लोगों ने डिमांड किया डार्ट में भी चाहिए तो वो लोग उसको लेके आए. सो जैसे कि C++ में इसको टेम्पलेट्स बोलते हैं, C में प्री प्रोसेसर्स बोलते हैं, रस्ट में मैक्रोस बोलते हैं, तो सेम नाम ही है. Swift में function builder बोलते हैं, and then in a Zig it called compile time execution. So it's the same thing taken from different languages and then it put it into Dart. And then this is an issue open on GitHub. It was around like 2021. Still it was one of the most requested features. So उन्होंने finally इस पे काम किया है. And one of the fascinating thing about like adding this kind of feature in language is that it does not get built into a month or two. It took them around more than 1.5 years to get at this point कि वो experimental feature बना सकें. And then to get a stable they will require one more year. So अभी ऐसा लगता है कि एक feature बना के डाल दिया, but it takes a lot of effort to build that effort, especially in programming languages. Now माइग्रोस तो फीचर है, बट भाई यूज़ ही क्यों करना है, मतलब ठीक है मुझे पता है पर क्यों यूज़ करेंगे उसको, ठीक है. सो देयर इज अ, फॉर एग्जाम्पल इफ यू वांट एन आइटम टू अ लिस्ट, लाइक सो हाउ वुड यू डू इट. यूजुअली you would do add 1 2 3. What will you do if you have 100 item? How would you write that code? Can anyone suggest? Yeah. So basically this is a repetitive code, right? 1 आ रहा है, 2 आ रहा है, 3 आ रहा है, and you know there is some logic in it, and then basically you can use a for loop. बहुत ही common sense है, ठीक है. लैंग्वेज ने एक फीचर बनाया, बट कॉमन सेंस की बात क्या पता है, वो उतना कॉमन नहीं है, ठीक है. सो आई हैड अ प्रोजेक्ट वेयर आई गॉट दिस कोड, जहाँ पे उन्होंने 200 लाइन्स ऑफ लिस्ट लिखी है जस्ट टू ऐड 200 नंबर्स, ठीक है. एंड वेन एवर यू आर डूइंग, प्लीज फॉर द लव ऑफ गॉड ये मत करना, ठीक है. ऐसे लूप में ऐसे वेरिएबल मत करना. सो द रीजन व्हाई आई एम सेइंग इज दैट कि whenever in a programming languages or any kind of software, whenever you see a repetitive code, they will try to abstract into something which can be reusable. अब लैंग्वेज में यू एड अ लिस्ट 1 2 3 4 5. अब लैंग्वेज को पता चल गया है कि ये लोग तो बार बार यही लिख रहा है. सो व्हाट दे डू इज दे इंट्रोड्यूस अ फीचर इन अ लैंग्वेज कॉल्ड फॉर लूप, कि आप फॉर लूप लगा के यू कैन ऑप्टिमाइज दिस. देयर इज ऑल्सो अदर वे, वाइल लूप के साथ भी आप यही सेम चीज़ कर सकते हो, बट दे नो कि दिस इज समथिंग इन द लैंग्वेज रिक्वायर्ड अगेन एंड अगेन, सो दे एड अ फीचर इन अ लैंग्वेज. And that's why they add macros. So they see something which get repeated again and again, and they provide a way in a language which you can automate very easily. So for example, if you have a widget tree like this, Android Compose को use करता है? Android Compose, anyone? Okay. So basically you define a list of columns here, and you see there is a repetitive code happening here. So what you will do in order to reduce this code? Yeah. So basically what will do is they will create a function here, and then they will just reuse it again, which is the parameter which is differentiating each property of that function, right? Simple. But what if you don't want to have a function, you want to have a widget for each type of it? Like here there is a called build column, there is a share build column, there is a root build column, right? So if you want to avoid an abstraction for this kind of thing, you cannot do in the Dart existing language. आप उस को abstract करके अलग अलग क्लासेस आप नहीं बना सकते, क्योंकि वो लैंग्वेज में अभी सपोर्ट नहीं है. बट इफ़ यू यूज़ मैक्रोज यू कैन बेसिकली डू इट. यू डिफाइन अ मैक्रो विच सेज कि इस कॉलम का मुझे ऐसा क्लास बना के दो, एंड इट विल ऑटोमेटिकली डू इट फॉर यू. सो यू डोंट हैव टू क्रिएट दैट क्लास मैन्युअली, इट्स जस्ट दैट द मैक्रोज डज फॉर यू. सो फॉर एग्जाम्पल देयर इज अ पर्सन क्लास विच बेसिकली हैव अ फर्स्ट नेम, लास्ट नेम एंड एज. ये क्लास किसी ने क्रिएट किया है अभी तक? Normally not in a Dart but in other languages, Java, something like it. So it's the same concept, it's an object, right? It has a person, first name, last name and age. Now when you're using this, basically what you need to do is you need to define some equality of that object, कि दो object को आप same कैसे करोगे. So there is a like you have to override the hash code and all those stuff, hash code equal to map to string and all, so that you can make sure that those two objects are same. So if you want to do the same thing in a Dart, you have to use a package, a different package to do it, which is basically called freeze. Anyone have used freeze package? So basically it does is कि वो class का code generate करता है and it makes sure that both are same. So you have to annotate annotation on the class, and then you have to extend that class, and then you have to import that package, and then you have to add a part where it will generate a different file where you can match both of those things. And then you run a command called dart run build runner build, and it will create a file. And when you run this command, it will take a lot of time. So what you'll do is you have to wait, right? Command चल रहा है, classes generate हो रही है, file generate हो रही है, it will take a lot of time. So you have to wait. And if your project is very big, then it might take a lot of time, right? उसको build करने में ही बहुत time चल जाता है. So it's a problem कि अगर आपका project scalable है and if you have a lot of files in it, it will generate more file added to your existing code, and it will take a lot of time. And if you want to add more functionality, आपको अगर JSON parsing भी करना है, like you want to parse into JSON from JSON into JSON. Anyone have done that? API call से JSON आता है, you have to transform that into a class object, and sometimes you have to make it into a JSON so that it can send you a request to an API call. और अगर आपको वो functionality भी उसमें add करनी है, then you have to use another library, and then you have to add a from JSON, and then again you have to run that dart run build, and you have to wait that it will generate the whole classes. And now earlier we used with the third party packages, but now we'll using macros. Now this is the class, right? The same thing which you want to have the equality and that same function. And what we'll do is we'll annotate with at the rate data, and this at the rate data will come from a macro, not from a third party package, but a class called macros data.dart, and that's it. You have to do that much only, nothing more than that, and it will feel like magic कि एक ही annotation किया and it's just working, right? You have to build that step and all, and it will just take, I think, few milliseconds. I think hardly 100 milliseconds just to generate that classes and make it work. And if you want to add a serialization, JSON serialization from and to from that class, you will just add one more notation and it's just done. So you don't have to worry about it. It will just work automatically. So this will be like more magic, right? Like दो notation add किया and it will work. So this is like my favorite one. So basically, how does this all works? So I'm going to go a little bit of under hood, so it will be more of a technical thing. So just try to please pay more attention to it. So you have the example, right? A JSON person, and you have a at the rate JSON codable for that. What it does when you add a notation, it creates a different augmented class, like a clone of that class, same class. And then in that same class, it will create all that necessary functionality for your classes. आपने annotation ही define किया है, उसके अलावा जितनी भी सारी चीज़ें हैं वो ये class करेगा. So you can see it has augmented person. You cannot directly use that in your code. You will directly use the class which you have created. And then you can see there is also a function generated to JSON. So you don't need to do this. Is basically सारा कुछ इस augmented class में आ जाता है and it get merged with your main class which you don't see. So it's just all compiler magic and the Dart language magic. And how the augmented class is generated is by this code. So you create your own macros and you write a code. आप उसमें code लिखते हो कि मेरा code कैसा होना चाहिए. So that's what the definition of macro is. It's just a piece of code which basically write a code, right? So far so clear कि ऊपर से जा रहा है, ठीक है. And this is like the main advantage of this is that whenever you make changes to that class, it directly does in your augmented class, so you don't have to wait for recompilation and rebuild. So आप जब change कर रहे हो, directly it gets changed. But हमारे पास पहले से ही code generation है, तो हमको ये क्यों करना है वापस से? तो उसके लाइक 4 रीजंस है. फर्स्ट, यू डोंट नीड एक्स्ट्रा थिंग टू रन, बिल्ड रन और वो कुछ भी नहीं चलेगा. इट्स जस्ट लाइक ब्लेजिंगली फास्ट. एंड देन देयर इज नो डुप्लीकेशन वर्क, रिकम्पाइलिंग भी नहीं होगी बिकॉज द लैंग्वेज टेक केयर ऑफ इट. कोई भी फाइल डिस्क पे नहीं रेट होती. जो जब भी कोई फाइल डिस्क पे राइट होती है, इट टेक्स अ लॉट ऑफ टाइम, सो इट डजंट डू दैट एज वेल. एंड देयर इज नो कंफ्यूजन और एनीथिंग रिलेटेड टू टेस्टिंग, सो वो भी बहुत ईजी हो जाता है. Now I'll just give some macro use cases कि ये कहाँ पे भी यूज हो सकता है. So पहला तो हमने देख लिया इक्वालिटी एंड सीरियलाइजेशन, जहाँ पे एक क्लास को इक्वल बनाना है या फिर सीरियलाइज बनाना है जेसन और फ्रॉम में. अब the next example is functional widget. So for example, I have a class called user avatar. If you have worked on a Flutter, you can just create a class which will be worked as a widget there. So you can do it, but it has a lot of boilerplate code, stateless, keys, user ID and all those things. You just want to focus on a build function कि मुझे क्या UI पे दिखाना है. So what you can do is you can just write a function similar to React. Anybody have worked on React? Build an application React? ठीक है, तो मुझे React में ही टॉक देना चाहिए था. So basically in the React you can basically define a function which works as a component. So this is what it taking from the React and trying to do in Flutter. So what you have to do is you define a function in a Flutter, and in function you define a context and whatever parameters you need, and then you define a functional widget annotation which basically does the same thing. It creates a class and does all the boilerplate code for you. So you are just worrying about building a function here and everything will take care of it. And this functional widget is basically a macro. Another example is stateless boilerplate code. So I'll just go quickly here. It's the same class which we have earlier on the stateless. And when we run this app, it required a parameter called dash. And what we can do is we can create a class, but we don't define any stateless or stateful anything related to it. We just define a plain class. Class को पता ही नहीं है कि ये कहाँ पे use होगा. And then we define an annotation called stateless, and it will write all the code which is on this side. Everything it will does by the macro itself. And if we want to add a parameter in a constructor, we just define that as an input. कि ये एज अ इनपुट होना चाहिए क्लास में, एंड इट्स बेसिकली क्रिएट अ कंस्ट्रक्टर फॉर इट. सो बेसिकली दिस नेम गोज टू दैट नेम. Similar for the stateful boilerplate code, you define a counter, and then when you click on it, it just update your data. So this is the full counter app, normal counter app where you have a scaffold, floating action button and a text button. And then you just replace that with a simple class, nothing stateless, stateful, nothing it. And then you define the similar thing, you define a stateful, and then you define an input to it. And then you can also define a default parameter to it कि अगर कुछ भी pass नहीं कर रहे, so it takes a 0. And since the macros are being spread across different classes, you can also use them together. For this example कि app है, an app is using a counter, so app is also using a macro, and the counter is also using a macro, and you can basically use the same thing here. So observable value, similar thing, you have a class and you want to make sure that whenever a field get updated, you can listen to it and update your changes on the UI. So for example, you have observable user and you add a notation on age and name, and then you can create that class, and just whenever you update those two fields, whoever listening to that observer user will get an update. Now this is getting one more way deeper, like what if you want to create your own macro. So I'll just quickly go over it. Like you have to first switch to the master channel, so it's not available on stable. Since I said it's an experimental, so you have to run Flutter channel master and upgrade it, and then you have to update your environment to 3.5 version, and then you have to update your analyzer to enable their experiment mode, and then you run command dart run enable experiment. So this is This is really important, just to make sure that whenever it runs that, it use macros as an experimental and not as a main feature of that language. Now I'm going in an example which is basically a simple example called log implementation. What I want to do is, I have a class called degree where I have a field Celsius, and I want to print or log that value. So whatever field I add to that class, I should have a function which can print that value. So to do that, I'll create a macro class called log, and this name is basically your annotation name. Earlier we saw like data and freeze and functional widget. This is the name of your annotate macro class. And then you implement a class declaration macro, and this is important because it implies that where do you want to apply this macro to. What I mean by is that let's say you have a class, so आपका माइक्रो है वो कौन सी फील्ड पे या कौन से कंस्ट्रक्टर पे या कौन सी क्लास पे लगेगा, या तो वो आपके क्लास पे लगेगा, या तो आपकी फील्ड पे कंस्ट्रक्टर फील्ड पे लगेगा, या फिर इट वुड बी ऑन योर फील्ड विच यू हैव डिफाइंड. सो दोज इम्प्लीमेंटेशन हियर defined from, there is a big list of it, you can choose whatever list is and it will implement it here कि आपको कौन सी चीज़ implement करनी है, आपको class level पे करना है, function पे करना है, field पे करना है या फिर constructor पे करना है. So हमको यहाँ पे class level पे करना है, that's why we have used class declaration macro. But if you want to do on a function and library, you have to use that as an implementation. And this will require it required to override a method called build declaration for class. Now here is a challenging part. In order to implement this, you need to know some like language semantics कि programming language के अंदर क्या क्या vocabulary use करते हैं, because you might not be aware of what declaration mean, what is member mean, where you should think about argument भी बोल सकते हैं, parameter भी बोल सकते हैं, member भी बोल सकते हैं. So you don't know which things you are talking about. So you have to go little bit detail into the language कि language के अंदर इसको क्या बोलते हैं, and then you will able to understand this. So इसमें थोड़ा मेहनत का काम है basically. So class declaration है, it will give you an information about the class, and then there is a builder parameter which is basically whatever things you put into that, it will build into your class. So what I want to do is I want to print the value of each field in the class. So what I'll do is first I'll take all the fields from that class. So I'll use this function builder.field of class, and then I'll just loop over each field. हर एक field के ऊपर से loop करूँगा and then see कि कौन सी value है. And then this function basically does is I'll just take the name of that field कि field का नाम क्या है and just capitalize the first word. And then there is a builder class where I have to declare कि मुझे क्या कोड लिखना है, मतलब इस क्लास के अंदर क्या कोड होना चाहिए. And this is where declaration from string come into the picture. आप directly string के format में कोड लिख सकते हो, या फिर you can use a different class to basically loop through and condition and add it. But for a simplicity sake, I'm just using a string here. And then I write this function in a string. So what this function does is basically the first one is void. So ये मैं function manually लिख रहा हूँ कि जो भी class हो उसके अंदर ये function automatic add होना चाहिए, मुझे manually लिखने की ज़रूरत नहीं है. So I'm using void, and then I'm using a prefix called log, and then I'm capitalizing word जो मैंने पहले ऊपर किया था वो I'm using here, and then I'm defining a body कि इस function की body क्या है, and then I'm printing the name here कि जो भी name की वो value है वो यहाँ पे print होनी चाहिए. So this is the function I want to be in every class where log का annotation use होता है. So basically it's a function I have written inside a function. So that's how it's working. So now how I will implement it कि degree class है, now I'll just add a log on top of it, and when I use on the main, now I will have a function called log Celsius. So if you see in my previous class degree, I haven't added any function called log Celsius. Since I use a macro and I wrote that code कि मुझे हर class के अंदर ये function चाहिए, it automatically added that function for me. So it's a log Celsius, and whenever I run this function, it will print the value of Celsius because वही हमने उसके कोड में लिखा है. And how does this work is, since we defined that function, it will create an augmented class of that same degree and add that function जो हमने string में लिखा था. Similarly, अगर Celsius है और मुझे कोई और पैरामीटर ऐड किया है, like Fahrenheit example, so if I run that on a main, I'll get another function called .log Fahrenheit because it depends on each field. So जितनी भी field बनेगी उसके log method बन जाएंगे. And if you go to the augmented class, now the augmented class will have two functions. And this is basically the simplest code for logging it. Now बहुत सारी चीज़ें अच्छी भी हैं, लेकिन देर आर ऑल्सो चैलेंजेस एज वेल. हर चीज़ के ट्रेड ऑफ्स होते हैं, प्रोज एंड कॉन्स होते हैं. सो ये सारे फीचर्स तो हैं, बट देर आर ऑल्सो सम चैलेंजेस इन बिल्डिंग मैक्रोस. सो व्हेन यू गो थ्रू दैट, प्लीज कीप दिस इन माइंड एज वेल. सो पहला है सिक्योरिटी कंसर्न कि मैक्रोस डिस्क पे राइट कुछ भी नहीं करता. एंड देर इज ऑल्सो कंसर्न कि व्हाट इफ किसी और ने कुछ मैक्रो मेरे अंदर इंजेक्ट कर दिया एंड इफ डू सम अदर स्टफ. सो देर इज अ दैट कंसर्न एज वेल. Performance, fast edit refresh cycle, since it generate code on a run time, every time you press a key it will try to generate a code for it. So it's a really challenging to have a developer experience where बहुत fast लगना चाहिए. और हम तो टिकटॉक और रील्स के ज़माने में रहते हैं, तो हम तो वेट तो कर ही नहीं सकते, तो तुरंत आधे सेकंड से कम में भी होना चाहिए. सो एंड स्कोपिंग एंड हाइजीन कि कितना स्कोप है, कहाँ तक उसका एक्सपेंडिशन होना चाहिए, नहीं होना चाहिए. ऑर्डरिंग एंड सेजिंग कि अगर आपने ऑर्डर में माइक्रोज डिफाइन किए तो पहला कौन सा वो यूज़ करेगा. एंड व्हाट इफ देयर आर नेस्टेड माइक्रोज कि मैंने जो माइक्रो लिखा है उसके अंदर भी माइक्रोज यूज़ हो रहा है. एंड व्हाट इफ कि जो फंक्शन द फंक्शन विच आई एम ट्राइंग टू क्रिएट विच इज़ ऑलरेडी देयर इन द क्लास, सो देयर माइट बी अ कॉन्फ्लिक्ट बिटवीन टू सेम फंक्शंस. डेवलपर टूलिंग एंड डीबगिंग, अभी तक डीबगिंग का उतना इजी है नहीं. सो एवरीथिंग यू हैव टू लॉग, मैन्युअली प्रिंट एंड सी दैट वेदर दैट वर्क्स और नॉट. सो देयर इज नो वे टू डीबग थ्रू IDE और एनी अदर टूल. सो दैट इज करंटली बीइंग वर्कड ऑन. ऑटो कंप्लीटेड माइक्रो जनरेटेड API जैसे लॉग सेल्सियस और फेरेनहाइट देखा, वो भी बहुत फास्ट होना चाहिए. एंड स्केलेबल टू बिग प्रोजेक्ट्स. हम बेसिकली अगर छोटे प्रोजेक्ट पे काम कर रहे हैं तो ठीक है, लेकिन व्हाट इफ you are working like a very big project like the FANG companies do, Facebook, Google और Netflix जैसी कंपनी में बहुत बड़े प्रोजेक्ट्स होते हैं, तो उसमें ये स्केलेबल कैसे होगा. So these are the challenges. So about macros, and these are the resources so far. You can check this out because मैंने भी बहुत सी चीज़ें वहीं से सीखी है. So you can basically check this blog out and go more detail into it. So yeah, that's it. This is my websites, and one more thing, I basically run, if you are Flutter developer and you want to advance your skill set, I run classes, live classes on weekends, Saturday, Sunday. So if anyone is interested in that, they can check out the detail on effectiveflutterdev.com and they can apply on that. So yeah, thank you, and